with public expenditure, we'll just pick up from there. This is strange. That's not what I'm looking for. And in this part of the work, remember we're only doing one part of Chapter 7, not the whole of Chapter 7. They talk about the reasons for government growth, and these are split into macro reasons and micro reasons. We started talking about Wagner's stages of development, where the suggestion is that government growth follows the development of an economy, meaning that at various stages of development, there will be different needs, there will be different demands on states, on governments to intervene in the economy in some way in order to support development. So in the early stages of development, for example, you need states to implement legal systems and other mechanisms to maintain law and order, both internally and externally. So you need to have an internal legal system that supports property rights, or that protects property rights, that supports free exchange, etc. And then you also need a state to defend against external threats. Then later on, as economies develop and move into the industrial sort of stage of development, it becomes important for government to invest in basic infrastructure, so roads, communication networks, etc., rail, and so on, and of course electricity. Then in the middle stages of development, government needs to deal with externalities, provide that they occur as a result of development, right, that we've discussed before. So there's a need for government to step in there, correct some of the market failures, and so on. Then, of course, in the late stages of development, we see that governments take on a more important role in providing social support to citizens, right? And in fact, that's what we saw in the graph that I showed you in the very first lecture, I think, in the very first live session, was the proportion of social expenditure to GDP across a set of countries, which accelerated over the course of the 20th century. So those are mainly countries that are in the latter stages of development, right? Okay. Another theory was put forward by Peacock and Wiseman. This one is called the displacement effect. This theory emphasized politics as explaining government growth, and particularly it suggests that growth follows upheavals that require public expenditure. The most dramatic of these upheavals being war, right? And if you look at the government expenditure for countries that were involved in particularly World War II, because good data are available for that period, you'll see a huge spike in government's expenditure as a share of GDP, more than 50% in cases like the UK, for instance. Now the theory is that, and that makes sense, right? That's something that you would expect if there's a war happening. You'd expect governments that needing to spend lots of money, needing to commit resources to the war efforts. But the theory suggests that even once an upheaval has passed, then you have the situation where taxpayers become somewhat accustomed to higher tax rates and a state that is more involved in the economy. And so it's as if the baseline for government expenditure and taxation goes up during an upheaval, and it doesn't necessarily go back all the way back down to its initial position. And as suggested in the textbook, this to some degree might explain some of the higher public expenditure in South Africa pre-apartheid, where the South African government was increasing expenditure on defense, right? There was some trouble at the border in the 80s, late 70s, 80s, and as well as internal unrest growing. And the state, and you see it in the data, the state increased defense expenditure significantly during those times. The third theory by Meltzer and Richard suggests, well, they emphasized redistributive policies, right? So the theory here is that as countries develop, we observe that governments extend the franchise. In other words, they grow, economies and countries become more inclusive in terms of, and become more democratic, which means that the median voter preferences do change. So think of the median voter that we talked about on Tuesday, and therefore politicians have to sort of, as we mentioned on Tuesday, politicians in the political marketplace will tend to target the median voter's preferences with their policy positions, right? Because if they can capture the median voter, it means they've captured 50% plus one. And in a majority rules democracy, that means that that they win the government, they win the seat, right? So the theory here is that as countries develop and as the franchise is extended and countries become more democratic, and of course there's the implicit suggestion here that with development comes more democracy. And although empirically that seems to have been the case, of course, we can't state that this is a causal mechanism here, that the reason countries became more democratic is because of industrialization and development and economic growth. In fact, it has long been suggested in the West that China has its comeuppance on the way, given its rapid development, and people have been making this claim since the 90s, when China started growing quite rapidly, that the citizens of China will not tolerate the authoritarian style of their government, and eventually China will be forced to become more democratic. And maybe there have been some changes in some processes in China, but it's still largely a sort of communist state, a socialist state, and somewhat authoritarian as well. So there's one, as an empirical matter, there's one sort of counterpoint to this idea, which is China. But in most of the rest of the world, we do observe that this has been the case, that with development has come greater democracy, and the median voter preferences do change. And you might suggest that this is what we saw in South Africa as well, right? Following 1994, following the end of apartheid, more people were enfranchised, and the median voter preferences in terms of people who were permitted to vote and participate in democracy definitely changed quite dramatically. But interestingly, we didn't see a massive shift in public expenditure following 1994. In fact, initially we saw efforts to try and contain the debt to GDP ratio, which at the time made sense and seemed to be the prudent thing to do. Although not everyone agreed with that. That's what the government decided at the time. But slowly, what you might think of as the median South African voters' preferences has somewhat prevailed, and most notably under Jacob Zuma, right, as president, where we saw huge expansions in social expenditure. So this to some extent might explain increases in South African government expenditure. Although the increases in expenditure we did see were not as dramatic as the theory might suggest on its face. Further, also suggests that in economies with highly skewed distributions, which is the case in South Africa, that voters will prefer redistributive policies, and this will necessarily increase the size of government expenditure as a share of GDP. Okay, Baumol's unbalanced growth product. These are part of the this is one of the micro models for growth in government. So Baumol had this idea of unbalanced productivity growth, which is a very interesting idea and is often invoked in discussions about inflation. So the idea of unbalanced productivity growth is that some sectors have more, that productivity growth across the economy is uneven among sectors, right? So some sectors will see high productivity growth, while others may see more subdued productivity growth or even stagnation. And Baumol's theory suggests that, well, we observe that much of what government does would be in sectors, would be the types of services, the types of activities that are not subject to huge increases in productivity growth. So if you think of the main services that government provides, these are education and health. You think of policing as well. Not huge productivity gains in those sectors, right? Whereas the private sector, on the other hand, is characterized by sectors that where we do observe high levels of productivity gains. Now, the problem is, where the problem comes in, and this is why Baumol's idea is often related to inflation, is that salaries can't diverge too much between the public and private sector, right? So despite the fact that you observe some sectors with low productivity growth compared to some other sectors, you won't necessarily see salaries compensation across those sectors diverging too much across the progressive and non-progressive sectors. So this will suggest that government will naturally grow as a share of GDP, even if it doesn't change how much it does, right? Even if it maintains the same level of activity over time, the mere fact that the salaries of workers in government will have to match salaries of individuals of workers in other sectors means that government's expenditure as a share of GDP will have to increase. And the reason the salaries match is not because people are greedy, people who work in government, necessarily workers. It's just a matter of basic economics, which is that workers will move to the sectors where the salaries increase. So government is in effect competing for workers with the private sector, which is why salaries for people in the education and health sector are as high as they are, in part. Well, certainly the health sector and some of the more specialized occupations that we have in some government departments, such as engineers, etc. With teachers, it's less clear that there's a lot of competition from outside of government, causing salaries to increase there. But we'll get to that in a moment as well. Okay, then there's Brown and Jackson's micro model. So they consider the factors influencing demand and supply for public goods, one of them being the population size. So as the size of the population in an economy or country grows, that implies that there's greater demand for government goods and services. And also government functions, and this of course can naturally result in higher expenditure or a particular good or service. And that brings us to the end of chapter 7. So I think let's just swiftly move into chapter 8, which I'd like to complete today as well. Right, so chapter 8 deals with fiscal incidents and service delivery in South Africa. So this is basically an overview of service delivery in South Africa, a very general overview. But for two main activities, which are health and education. So we'll talk a little bit, there is a little bit of theory that we will go through in terms of social expenditure. And then we'll just do a general overview of service delivery in education and health in South Africa. Current status and how we got there. Okay, so these are the topics we'll go through in the next hour or so, starting with the rationale for redistribution. Okay, so as we've noted over and over, the Pareto optimal distribution of a market economy is income neutral, or is neutral to the distribution of outcomes, right? So our benchmark model is indifferent to how skewed the outcomes of the market process are, right? And that was one of the rationales for government intervention, is to correct for the skewed outcomes, among others. And we've talked about all the rest. We've talked about government intervening in cases of externalities. We've talked about government intervening to correct imperfect markets or to respond to imperfect markets, including imperfect competition, monopoly, etc. Now, it turns out government can be good at redistribution. There is a case to be made for private redistribution in the form of NGOs, etc. And many sort of libertarian-leaning people thinking about policy would suggest that there should be more scope, or government should be more supportive of private redistribution. So in essence, supporting the establishment and development of NGOs. But it turns out that government is quite good at redistribution, given its scale, right? And given its sort of access. Now, of course, there can be problems, as we've seen in South Africa with the distribution of the pensions through certain firms, and some tender process irregularities, etc. But those are things that ultimately have to be dealt with by the governing party internally, or by the voters choosing a party that doesn't engage in improper practices when it comes to state tenders, etc. Now, in general, across the world, governments engage in redistribution, and they do this through taxes and expenditure. And redistribution is meant to expand the opportunities and choices for people in society, particularly those who are most vulnerable, those who are worst off. So it's not just a matter of taking from the rich and giving to the poor, right? It's not just a Robin Hood situation. The idea is that redistribution is done in such a way that the beneficiaries of redistribution see an expansion of the opportunity set, right? As we would say in macroeconomics. That it opens up doors otherwise closed to them. Of course, realizing these benefits is not guaranteed in practice, right? So it's all good and well to have this social system that we have a transfer of income and also an expansion of opportunities to the less well off in society, but implementation matters as well, right? and is an important component of a government social program. Okay. Now we can ask the question: does South Africa's transfer and social expenditure programs, do they promote greater well-being through social mobility? And of course, by social mobility, what we mean is, can people climb the rungs of society from one generation to the next? In other words, is it the case that a significant share of people born in households that are, say, in the bottom quartile of the income distribution can move up to higher quartiles of the income distribution? I'm curious on your thoughts on this question. Do you think our social expenditure programs promote social mobility in South Africa currently? If yes, raise your hand. Okay, no one's raising their hand. If no, raise your hand. All right, so 2 people responded, both no. And the rest of you are neutral on this matter, I presume. So you're not sure whether it does promote social mobility or does not. Okay, thanks for your participation there. It turns out that, well, some studies suggest that it actually does promote social mobility, our social expenditure programs. Not dramatically, but it does carry some benefits. For one thing, what we observe in some studies, and this is more in the sort of domain of development studies, less public, but these some researchers have found that, for instance, households that receive old age grants and child support grants do observe benefits in terms of educational attainment, for instance. So people tend to go to school. Kids go to school. They stay in school longer, and they achieve better educational outcomes as a result of receiving the grant. So it does promote social mobility, but again, we do have the implementation issue across our departments. It's not just the grants that, for the most part, the grants get to the people, right? There are some issues with it. Maybe it's more expensive than it needs to be, but people are getting grants, and that in itself is somewhat of an achievement, right? That sounds like a trivial matter, but I think there's something like 16 million, I forget how many, maybe it's 12 million. It's in the teens. Between 12 and 16 million children who are getting grants from government every month, right? And many seniors as well, many pensioners getting their pensions every month. And for the most part, it's working smoothly. And that is somewhat of an achievement. And it has benefits for those households. Not just in terms of the cash, but in terms of some of the other indicators I mentioned, like educational attainment. Okay. So the rationale for redistribution. The budget is the most important redistributive mechanism that is available to government and that is available in society in general. Despite what the proponents of NGOs might say, government, it appears, is most efficient at redistributing resources in a society. Now, when we say the budget, we mean both tax and expenditure, and we have to be careful when we implement redistributive mechanisms like progressive taxation, and government has to consider the implications of taxation, right? So, for instance, does raising taxes have an effect, have a deleterious effect on investment in human and physical capital. And this is not a specific topic we go into too much in this course, but it's definitely something that you will cover in more depth in a postgraduate public economics course. Is the effect of taxes on activities, on outcomes that we think of as having positive externalities, right? Things that we actually want in society, which is investment in human and physical capital. One example of this, just offhand, is lawmakers in the US often compare tax rates in the US to Scandinavian countries and Western Europe countries. And it's much higher in Scandinavian and Western European countries relative to US countries in general. And lawmakers on the more conservative side in the US will point to the fact that this disincentivizes business creation in Europe, and that's why you see much more business creation, especially small businesses in the US. So an example that they might give is that people in Europe would be more inclined to do general household work themselves, like fixing the roof or something like that, than hire someone, because it's having a company that does that sort of thing in Europe will just cost more than it does in the US because of the tax system there. But these are sort of anecdotal things. But there are also research papers that look at this sort of thing and find that there is an effect. And as economists, we take this as given, right? People respond to incentives. If you increase the price of something, there will be less demand for it, right? And it's no different with taxes. Here in South Africa, given our apartheid legacy, there's been a lot of demands on our fiscal policy, right? And the budget year is always under pressure for greater social expenditure. And as we saw, as I mentioned earlier, under Mbeki, I think Mbeki introduced the child support grant system, or at least expanded it. So there was already upward movement of social expenditure, and then, of course, it accelerated under Zuma as well. And of course, Zuma's last move was to promise free higher education, which led to all sorts of problems, because it was simply impossible for us to provide free higher education, given our budgetary constraints. And it's unclear whether that was purely a political move to remain popular and to retain power, etc., or whether it was a genuine, thought-out idea in terms of assessing the needs of citizens of South Africa and our capacity to respond to those needs. All right. Income inequality and poverty. Now, South Africa is considered to be, one of the rationales for redistribution is to address the issues of inequality and poverty. And we are considered to be, South Africa, that is one of the most unequal countries internationally. If you look at the Gini coefficient, ours is typically measured somewhere between 0.6 and 0.7. And depending on the data source, and some data sources suggest that there has been an increase in inequality, income inequality in South Africa after 1994, right? And most of that is driven by within race group inequality, right? So one of the exercises we did when I was a graduate student was calculate Gini coefficients for South Africa as a whole and for different race groups. And if you look at the Gini coefficient at the time for blacks as a population alone, the Gini coefficient was actually higher than it was for the whole country. So most of the rise in income inequality is driven by within race group inequality. As I said, different data sources do suggest different patterns of inequality over time. So some suggest that there's been somewhat of a decline in inequality over time, but some patterns also suggest an increase in inequality. And we'll look at how state intervention affects these measures in a moment. What we do know is that inequality is rather extreme when you compare it internationally. And the blue text here gives you a link to a site that shows some comparative data on inequality. One thing that is clear from data, though, is that poverty has declined since the year 2000, right? There have been some sort of shifts, some inflections in poverty levels over the years, particularly recently, given the very low per capita GDP growth. In fact, the data right now suggests that we've basically stagnated since 2009 in terms of per capita GDP growth. And as a result of that, there has been somewhat of an inflection in poverty levels, particularly child poverty in South Africa. Okay, so redistribution. Again, government budget is an important instrument for redistribution. This, of course, is in addition to the other things that government does, which is implement laws, regulations, and also its procurement system, which is itself a mechanism for redistribution and for promoting BBBEE, etc. The budget directly affects the income distribution, both through taxes as well as expenditure. Of course, if we have a progressive tax system, that in itself is redistributive, where high-income individuals contribute more to the budget, and the lowest income individuals often contribute no income taxes. There's also other progressive tax instruments. Well, taxing income progressively is one redistributive tax mechanism. Another is taxing wealth, and then also having taxes on having some excise duties, taxes on luxury goods, etc. Government expenditure choices, especially social expenditure, naturally reveals government's redistributive stance, and we have quite a significant redistributive stance in South Africa that is expressed through our budget. And of course, social spending takes two forms. They can be in the form of grants and subsidies of goods and services. So grants would be a direct cash transfer, right? So that would be something like the child support grant or the old age pension. That's where government actually just gives money to people, right? Subsidization would be something where government subsidizes some activity to the benefit of less well-off people, or to the benefit of all citizens. And the two most prominent examples of subsidizing activities would, of course, be, or providing services would be health and education, and of course, policing. Okay, so let's look at social expenditure in a little bit of theory related to social expenditure. So as mentioned, there are two types. Social expenditure can take two forms. Those are in-kind subsidies, that is, in-kind means some service or subsidizing some service, right? So these relate to the provision of publicly provided goods and services, or publicly funded goods or services. Examples being health and education expenditure. Grants, on the other hand, are cash transfers. And I give some examples at the bottom there: the child support grant, disability grant, grant in aid, war veterans grant, etc. Now, a majority of our social expenditure here in South Africa takes the form of in-kind subsidies. And of course, the reason for that is because of the high expenditure on education and health in South Africa. So, for example, in the 2021 fiscal year, we had expenditure on health and education equaling 626 billion. and development expenditure, most of which I think comprises the grants that are listed under the grants definition. That totaled 310 billion. So less than 50% of the in-kind expenditure, social expenditure. Notice also that this comes to nearly 1 trillion rand. That's the grants together with health and education expenditure. So I think our budget was around 1.5 or 1.6 trillion. So a vast majority of our expenditure is social expenditure in South Africa, and for most countries. All right, so this chart compares different countries in terms of their direct transfers versus so grants on the one hand versus in-kind expenditure on the other. And you'll notice here that South Africa is not different to other countries in this respect at all. So the grant expenditure as a share of GDP is given by the dark blue bars, which I'm pointing at over here. And you'll see that South Africa, as I mentioned, direct transfers make up a small, not a small, but a smaller proportion of social expenditure than does our in-kind expenditure. And that is the case for all of the countries listed on this chart. By the way, for all these charts, these data that I'm presenting to you, to get to the source, you can just click on the chart, okay? There are hyperlinks embedded in these charts. So if you want to look at the source of the data, click on the chart. Okay, so another thing that's interesting here is that South Africa has the highest social expenditure among all these countries that are listed here, even though we don't have the highest gross national income per capita. Right? So the dots on the chart give us the per capita national income, and the height of the bars give us the proportion of GDP spent on social activities. So we have the highest social expenditure as a proportion of GDP, and we're roughly in the middle when it comes to, among these countries, when it comes to national income per capita. I was a bit surprised to see that both Brazil and Mexico have such small direct transfer programs, because I know that that these two countries have some of the largest cash transfer programs. In Brazil, there's the Bolsa Familia program, and they are much bigger countries as well. Brazil has something like 200 million people, Mexico about 110 or 120 million. And they have huge direct transfer programs, both these countries. Bolsa Familia in Brazil, and there you can see that their direct transfer expenditure is larger than South Africa's. That's the only country that has a direct transfer expenditure proportion of GDP higher than South Africa's. But for Mexico, it's quite small, so they might have decreased that. Well, they're much richer than us as well, so it could just be the case that they, well, not much richer, but they are richer than we are. So it could just be the case that the target population is, as a proportion of total population, is smaller than is the case for South Africa. Other interesting things we can look at in this chart, but I'll move on. So this chart shows you that our grant system is fairly generous, relatively, and this, so this sort of combines the idea of the grants of the direct transfers conditional on poverty levels, right? So as I mentioned up here, both Brazil and Mexico are richer than us, which could explain to some extent the lower transfer proportions and social expenditure in general. And here you see huge differences in these data. So this shows the proportion, the percentage of income that the grant makes up for people, right? So it's share of market income deciles. So the first bar over here, this tall spike, shows you the proportion of market incomes that the grant makes up for people in the lowest decile. So the 10 lowest income, the 10th. So if you split the population into 10 groups, from where the first group is the lowest in terms of the income distribution, and the 10th group is the highest in terms of the income distribution. This would be the first group over here, the spike. So the grants that we transfer make up, 12 times the market income that group of people earn in the market in South Africa, which is quite astounding. But what this shows is that our grants are very well targeted, right? It's the poorest do benefit significantly from our grants, especially compared to other countries. But it also speaks to the poverty levels in South Africa relative to some of these countries as well, and especially the highly skewed income distribution in South Africa. All right, so in-kind transfers, a bit of theory, as I said. So in-kind transfers are transfers that are services that are provided by government or that are funded by government, right? So public provision and subsidization of goods and services, although more popular than grants, can give rise to economic inefficiencies, and that's what this graph shows over here. So this is demand and supply for some good or service. Let's say it's education. So initially you have a demand curve here, supply curve. New price equals marginal cost. That's given as a straight line just for simplicity. We're much more interested in how much of this gets consumed. So initially you have intersection at EO, so that's the equilibrium. And let's say government isn't happy with the fact that only QO of education is being consumed. It wants to expand education consumption to Q1, right? So government subsidizes the provision of education to the value of POP1, right? And given that subsidy, that will then shift demand out to Q1, and you'll end up in equilibrium E1, right? So individuals will pay P1 due to the subsidy of the difference between PO and P1, right? Which means that Q1 is demanded in that situation. Okay, so that's fantastic, right? So we've increased what do we call this area now? We've increased the I'm blanking on this now. Can someone remind me? The area between the price level and the demand curve is anyone? Here we go. Thank you. So we've expanded consumer surplus from AEOPO to AE1P1, right? So this purple area is the consumer surplus gained as a result of the subsidy. Now, let's consider the cost of the subsidy. The cost is the difference P1 multiplied by Q1, right? So the cost of providing this subsidy equals the rectangle POB E1P1. So there's an excess burden to the provision of the subsidy, given by this triangle PEOE1, right? And you can think of that as a deadweight loss, okay? Now, if this was a subsidy that had no external benefit, then that would actually be a deadweight loss to society, right? That would be an inefficient provision of this good or service. So again, as stated on this slide, although public provision and subsidization is the more popular means of social expenditure, it can give rise to economic inefficiencies, as demonstrated on this slide, right? Now you might ask, well, would direct transfers be a better option then than providing a subsidy or providing the good or service? And the answer to this is somewhat complicated and depends on a bunch of factors, right? Most important of which is, would the grant be spent on education? Let's say that was education. This was the market for education. If government gave people this difference here, this subsidy, gave it directly to people, would they spend that money on education, or would they spend it on other things? And of course, in the presence of externalities, the calculus here changes, right? Our analysis changes once you introduce the concept of positive externalities on this chart, right? The reason being that this might express the private benefit, this demand curve, but there's also a social benefit that lies above this demand curve, right? Which could mean that potentially this, what was initially considered an excess burden, might no longer be an excess burden if you take the social benefit into account, right? Including the positive externality. So in the presence of externalities, in-kind transfers can be efficient, right, in theory, because the marginal social benefit lies above the marginal private benefit. It's greater than the marginal private benefit. Consumer welfare can be increased by direct subsidization or provision of a good or service, particularly education and health. Further, there is no guarantee that a cash transfer will increase expenditure on the intended good or service, right? So say if government sent out an education grant, so you call this an education grant, you tell people, yeah, I'm giving you some money. This is meant for your education. Spend this on your child's education. That's not necessarily going to be the case that people will spend that money on the child's education. All right. So let's look at in-kind subsidies where we have a positive externality. So this is the demand and supply for an individual. Okay. So the MPB would be the marginal private benefit. So this would be the individual's demand curve. And of course, the individual does not consider the external benefit of consuming education. So the consumption is given by the intersection of MPB and MC. And here you have quantity of QO demanded. And if we consider the MEB, which is the marginal external benefit, and we add that to MPB, we then get this kinky line here, MSB, marginal social benefit to consuming education. And when we look at the intersection of that with marginal cost, with the supply curve, we end up at an equilibrium E1, so which raises quantity consumed to Q1. Now, if you look at this purple shaded rectangle here, initially you would have had if you just look at the private benefit curve and government subsidizing this, you could have also raised quantity consumed, but you would have had the excess burden here given by this rectangle. Whereas if we consider the marginal social benefit now, we bring that into the analysis, we observe that we have an efficient outcome, right? We have efficient consumption level of consumption of education. as a result of the subsidy. Okay. Primary versus secondary income. So this is something that gets used in the analysis of fiscal incidence. In other words, how does government's budget affect individuals or groups of individuals across, say, the income distribution? So here we distinguish between two types of household income. There's primary income, which is all income in cash or kind, earned or received by households. So this is market income essentially. Then we consider secondary income, which is primary income minus direct taxation plus the value of government services consumed. And that's given by the equation over here, right? Now for some people, and measuring this is not easy, right? Because you have to value the services provided by government. And that's not necessarily an easy thing to do, valuing education, because everyone's that value will differ across individuals and groups. So in this relation over here, YS is secondary income, YP primary income, TD direct taxes, and then G is government expenditure. And these calculations do get done, and I'll show you some results in a moment of this. But the idea here is just to sort of illustrate this idea that government intervention, government's budget, and as well as its expenditure programs will affect people, will result in this difference between primary income and secondary income. And that's how we assess fiscal incidence. So this chart shows you the Gini coefficient for South Africa. You're looking at market income on the left, and then looking at using this this relation here on the right. Okay, so over here we have Gini coefficient, and again you can find the link. Unfortunately, I can't find the paper for this. Only the slide presentation on Treasury's website for this chart. I wish I had could find the paper where it was estimated, but nonetheless, I'll take this as a sort of decent ballpark figure. I've seen other results that are similar, except for this one. This one I haven't seen elsewhere yet, but this is the most interesting one. Okay, so if you look at market income only, we see a Gini coefficient of 0.77, which is very high. Then after tax, we see that goes down to 0.75. Well, net market income, and then when we look at disposable income, so this is plus transfers, and I'm not sure what FPS is, but so this takes tax into account, this takes transfers into account, and then this takes this is direct tax, and then this takes indirect taxes into account, and all the while we see it going down, except here. This is interesting. So here you have 0.694. Once you take indirect taxes into account, we get a value of 0.695. So that's very interesting. It would be interesting to try and reproduce that result, because this suggests that our indirect taxes, VAT and fuel, are regressive, which I suppose in theory we've always suggested, but this is showing empirically that that's the case. Because that would make up the larger proportion of indirect taxes. But then we have this huge decline, a 0.1 point decline in the Gini coefficient when we consider education and health expenditure, when we throw that into the mix as well. As I mentioned, this sort of thing is a bit difficult to measure. I'm not sure how they did it in this case. I would have loved to have known. But it's not unreasonable to expect this decrease in the Gini coefficient as a result of education and health expenditure. Because it's the largest share of our budget, we expect that it would make the most dramatic difference in Gini coefficient, if we include that. Okay, so this is just another way of showing the same thing. This here shows you the Lorenz curve. As you might remember from earlier courses, here you have the line of perfect equality, and then Lorenz curves sort of bend towards the bottom right corner. And the further it diverges from this line of perfect inequality, the more unequal the income distribution in a given country. So this just shows you the shift from YS to YP. So YS is given by this outermost Lorenz curve over here, and YP is given by the dotted line over here. So, and this is for South African data. So our tax and transfer system is very progressive, right? Benefits the worse off more than the well off. Okay, this just shows you the same data in a different way. And I'm going to move on to talking about service delivery in health and education very quickly. All right, so service delivery matters for citizens' general quality of life, but importantly, also its future opportunities. And the suggestive evidence that satisfaction with government service delivery in South Africa has declined or has worsened over time. And this is from surveys that some institutes do, with going out and asking people, are you happy with service X or Y? And this is despite an increase in service delivery and social expenditure in South Africa. As I mentioned at the start, implementation matters. Now, the stated reasons for dissatisfaction often relate to the material issues, such as inadequate housing, lack of access to electricity and sanitation services. These are the immediate concerns that people have with government services, well, that they have in their lives, right? Housing, electricity, and sanitation. Deeper and in the long term, damaging outcomes include poor health and education services, right? So people might talk about this most when you ask them, what are you unhappy with in terms of government's service delivery? And those are important, absolutely. But these factors over here, public health and education, are also very important, specifically because it has an effect on the potential long-term growth prospects of a country. And of course, these interrelate, right? These two things, public health and education, definitely interacts with things like adequate housing, sanitation, electricity, and so on. All right, these outcomes highlight that expenditure increases do not necessarily guarantee better outcomes, okay? And it's unclear exactly where, it's not always easy to pinpoint faults for this. Where in the service delivery chain do we observe the failures? Is it lack of accountability? Is it due to corruption? Or is it just due to capacity in the public sector? All right, now when we evaluate service delivery, it's useful to distinguish between outputs and outcomes, and government departments themselves would often do this. So outputs are observable deliverables from a program or process that are easily measured. So you can think of, in the case of education, an output would be the number of learners enrolled in school as a share of age-eligible children, right? Or the number of matriculants passed in a given year. That's an output of the education system. Outcomes, on the other hand, are deliverables linked to the ultimate objective of the program or process. And unlike outputs, outcomes are much more difficult to measure. So governments would typically report on outputs because those are things that are easily measured and easy to point at. But of course, the objective of a program is usually an outcome, which is a bit more amorphous, a bit harder to measure, right? So think of education. The outcome is adequately preparing individuals for work or higher education. Another way to put it is the outcome of the targeted outcome of education is to have an educated population, right? In other words, the purpose of education, of basic education, is to teach people stuff. So the outcome is that people coming out of the system know things. They know things, they know how to do things, etc. That's the outcome. difficult to measure. The best measure we have are the test scores, right? So we test what people know when they leave the education system, and that is it's not a perfect measure of an outcome, but it's what comes closest in terms of actually looking at the targeted outcome of the education system, rather than just saying that we had X number of students enrolled, we have X number of students who passed matric. The question is, what do those students know, right? What can they do? Are they prepared for higher education? Are they prepared to take up an occupation? What kind of occupation are they prepared to take up in the economy? Okay, so with that in mind, let's look at how we are faring in terms of our education and health provision in South Africa. Now, there's a clear rationale for subsidizing education. Improved educational outcomes do improve individuals' prospects in the labor market, and it also correlates positively to economic development at a population level. And in South Africa, improving educational outcomes has been particularly challenging, given the historical underinvestment in education, right, under apartheid for most of its citizens. And although we've made quite a bit of progress in reversing this in terms of access to education, educational outcomes do remain highly unequal. And I suspect that educational outcomes, the inequality in educational outcomes actually maps well onto the inequality in incomes, right, in the labor market that we observe. In fact, educational outcomes might even be more unequal in some sort of abstract way, right? So although access to education is nearly universal, the quality of education offered by government is not universally good, right? And a better understanding of our system may be important for understanding, as I just suggested, the outcomes that we see in the labor market, right? Okay. So our education system is very well funded. So this is the budget for the 2021 fiscal year. Education has generally been government's largest single line item in the budget. Of the total allocation committed to education, 63% is budgeted for basic education. So naturally, most of the budget goes to basic education. That's where most of the kids getting educated are. Also, education expenditure is very pro-poor. You might know that our school system is segmented into quintiles, and these quintiles are based on socio-economic conditions of the surrounding neighborhoods of those schools, so poverty rates, etc. And schools in the lower three quintiles are designated no-fee schools, whereas the upper quintiles are fee-paying schools, right? And therefore, 60% of schools in South Africa are no-fee schools. Now, there are some implications that are somewhat less than ideal as a result of this, right? The fact that the upper tiers of the schools are fee-paying means that, to an extent, poorer households might be excluded from accessing those education opportunities, which is not ideal. Okay, so this just shows you the different quintiles by province in this table. So you'll notice, so you have provinces in the rows, and the quintiles as the columns, quintile 1 to 5, and this shows you the segmentation of quintiles by province. So you'll see that the Western Cape has very few schools that are designated as quintile 1. In fact, most of the Western Cape schools are fee-paying schools, are designated quintile 4 and 5, right? So 60% of Western Cape schools are in quintile 5. For Gauteng, it's quite high as well, more than 50%. And For some other provinces, most of the schools, the vast majority of schools are in the lower 3 quintiles, non-fee paying schools. And very few schools are fee paying. So if you look at the Eastern Cape, for example, only 28% of all schools are fee paying. And for Limpopo, it's even lower at 23%. Right. So, of course, this maps onto the different poverty rates across provinces. All right, now let's consider the outcomes of all of this expenditure on education in South Africa. So this chart shows you the TIMS scores. So this TIMS is the trends in maths and science study. So these are international assessments that are undertaken. I think it's every, I'm not sure what the periodicity of it is. I think it's every 2 or 3 years. It could even be every 5 years. I'm not sure. But I don't think it's every year. So a bunch of students are given the same assessment, and there's no bias in terms of language or culture or anything like that. And they are then evaluated based on this assessment, and countries can then be ranked in terms of the scores that learners obtain in these tests. And this is the ranking for 2015. And these are maths and science assessments, okay? And we are second last in this ranking. The one country that ranked lower than us is Kuwait, which is a bit of a strange country. It's an oil-rich country, so they actually don't even need to worry about growth or development or any of those things. Yeah, they've got enough oil to. In fact, something like 50% of the population in Kuwait are expats. So they've got enough money to import all the skills that they need to keep the economy going. But anyway, enough about Kuwait. The point is that South Africa ranks extremely low in these comparisons, and we're not just comparing to rich countries. There, we do pretty poorly, even compared to less developed countries as a group as well. So most expenditure on education takes place at the provincial level, and this expenditure has increased quite significantly, particularly after the recession of 2008-2009. So as I mentioned, after Zuma came into power, our social expenditure sort of ramped up somewhat. And between 2000 and 2007, education expenditure as a share of GDP declined somewhat. So this is as a share of GDP, not in real terms or in absolute terms. And then it subsequently increased to 6% and has since hovered around that level. So this chart shows you the education expenditure as a share of GDP from between 1987 and 2017. So it went up somewhat pre-apartheid. Then, as I mentioned, we had to consolidate our public finances post 1994. And then after the recession, ironically, as our growth started stagnating, we increased as a share of GDP our education expenditure. Some of the rise in expenditure is explained by increases in teacher salaries, and if you want to know where most of the expenditure takes place, it is teacher salaries. Around 80% of education expenditure is compensation of employees. But other components like infrastructure also grew significantly between 2000 and 2007. All right. Access versus quality in our education system. So the distinction between access to education, which is are people going to school, and the quality of education, which is how much learning takes place once they arrive at school, is a very important distinction in the South African context. South Africa has high enrollment rates, so access to education in South Africa is near universal, right? Almost all kids in South Africa do have access to education facilities. of course, there's a lot of variation in the quality of that access. The proportion of students attending schools who do not pay school fees in South Africa in 2018 was nearly 70%, right? So, which is very significant. So most of our kids in school, most of the households in South Africa don't have to pay school fees. And in addition to that, there are programs at school that also give kids food, etc., which both serves as an incentive to get kids to school, but also alleviates some of the burden of poorer households in terms of providing food for kids. The progress made in access to education, unfortunately, it has not been matched by educational outcomes. So our graduation rates tend to be lower than average when compared to countries with a similar income level as ours. And by graduation rates, I mean the share of a given cohort graduating from high school is fairly low, as well as the share of graduates who enter into higher education is also quite low. So this chart looks at the relationship between education quality, measured by test scores again, and unemployment for a bunch of countries. And South Africa is over here, bottom left of this graph. So unemployment rate is given on the vertical axis, and education quality, these are the test scores that students produce, is given on the horizontal graph. So the lower you are on the left axis, the higher on the vertical axis, the higher the unemployment rate, and the further you are along the horizontal axis, the higher your education quality as measured by test scores. Okay, so South Africa is closest has the lowest education quality on this chart, and has the third highest unemployment rate. Okay, but more important, what we do observe is a positive correlation, even if you exclude these outliers over here. There does appear to be somewhat of a positive correlation between unemployment rates and, in the way it's expressed on this graph. But there does seem to be a negative relationship between educational quality and unemployment rate, meaning that the higher the educational quality, the lower the unemployment rate. Okay? This table I took from the Department of Basic Education report that they issue each year on education outcomes for basic education. And the main thing I want to highlight here are these two rows, the bottom three rows, effectively, of this table. So here you have the low SES, the bottom 25% in terms of income, socioeconomic status, versus the top 25% in terms of socioeconomic status. And this is for the Department of Education schools, right? So I think this excludes private schools, which would make it even more skewed. And then the columns tell you the proportion of kids that achieve at different levels. So level 1 would be very poor performance, and whereas level 8 would be exceptional performance, very high performance, right? And so these rows show you the proportion of children performing at these different levels for different socioeconomic statuses, bottom 25 and top 25. And what we notice is that the higher you are in terms of socioeconomic status, the higher you will perform on average, right? So about 30% of, 31% of high SES kids perform at level 7 and 8, whereas only 12.7 kids of low SES kids perform at level 7 and 8. So this shows that there's a clear relationship between socioeconomic status and performance and educational outcomes, effectively. And this chart shows a comparison on this measure between South Africa and other African countries. So this is from SACMEC, which is similar to TIMSS, but it's only for African countries, Southern and Eastern Africa, I think. So if you compare South Africa to other African countries, this chart on the right shows the mean reading score for the poorest 25 students. And South Africa is almost the worst performing in this measure. And then this chart on the left shows you a similar sort of thing. So the key thing to note here is the length of each line and the slope of each line. So the steeper a line is on this chart, the more unequal the educational outcomes are, conditional on socioeconomic status, right? Conditional on income level. So a steeper slope means that the gap between the performance of low-income individuals or children and high-income children is larger than it is for flatter slopes. And then the length of the line also suggests that that there's a large distributional gap between low-income and high-income individuals in a population. Now, South Africa doesn't have the steepest line. Mauritius actually does. But we do have the longest line here. And the position of the line is also significant. The position tells you the level at which people are scoring, right? So the lower the line is, the worse the students are performing. All right. So Seychelles, Kenya, Tanzania, Mauritius all perform exceptionally well. Mauritius has even more unequal outcomes than South Africa by this one measure. But it performs significantly better. So even its poor performing students perform at the level of our sort of median student, right? Okay, so quality, not good in South Africa on average, and very unequal, okay? That's sort of the main point. And that's the summary that I'll leave you with there as well. Okay, going through health very quickly. And here, things don't get any more positive. Outcomes are not necessarily more positive in the health sector. Again, health is another pillar of human capital and also has implications for economic progress, for future development, etc. And the reason for this is that at the individual level, improved health status suggests better productivity, and at the population level, it does correlate with higher economic growth, which is illustrated on this chart over here. I won't talk about that any further. All right, so South Africa's health system. For the 2021 fiscal year, the healthcare allocated 230 billion, or about 12% of the total budget, to education, to healthcare. Healthcare was allocated 230 billion rand, or 12% of the total budget. And expenditure is significantly lower than education. However, private healthcare expenditure is substantial as well, right? So there's much more expenditure in private healthcare compared to public healthcare than there is the case for education, okay? So there's a WHO report which suggested that in 2014, private insurance schemes accounted for 43% of total healthcare expenditures, but only cover 16% of the population. So health, like education, also highly unequally distributed in South Africa. And I'm saying that because we know that private healthcare is just of a different quality than public healthcare. Now, this 43% is not the whole story either, because that's just private insurance, right? That's how much people are spending on medical aid schemes. But there's a lot of private expenditure on private healthcare that is not sort of facilitated via medical aid schemes. So a lot of people are accessing private health, and the expenditure on private health is probably more than 50% in South Africa. And of course, government announced, I think it was more than 10 years ago, that when government announced the implementation of a national health insurance scheme, but it seems to have sort of, it's not clear where we are at what stage we are with the implementation of that as yet, more than 10 years later. It was always going to be a long-term process, implementing a national health insurance scheme. but it's increasingly looking like it's going to be a difficult thing to implement financially and in terms of capacity. Okay. More than 80% of South Africans are served by the public health sector. So, as mentioned, medical aid schemes cover only 16% of the population, despite the fact that more than 40% of expenditure, or total health expenditure in the country, is facilitated through these schemes. Many uninsured South Africans do seek medical care at private institutions as well, which is to some extent a reflection of both the capacity and the quality of the public health service. And as mentioned in recent years, government has proposed a bill to nationalize healthcare, essential healthcare. Okay, so our system is challenged in its capacity to respond to disease burdens. South Africa has a relatively high disease burden compared to similar countries at a similar level of development to us. In particular, TB is somewhat of a scourge in South Africa. In 2014, we accounted for 15% of global TB cases here in South Africa. We also have a very high HIV infection rate compared internationally. And so our health system is challenged, and if you consider our level of development, it's especially disconcerting. Now, real expenditure on healthcare did grow quite significantly post-apartheid, and this was mainly to expand access to poorer households. So, and a lot of it was infrastructure. So, lots of clinics were built, etc., over this period. New hospitals built as well, and this has resulted in an increase in per capita health expenditure. And there was also a compositional change in health expenditure. There was more focus on primary care, which are in the form of clinics in communities, but this came at the expense of a decrease in expenditure for tertiary care, which is what occurs at hospitals. And there's been, so there's been somewhat of an issue at our hospitals with respect to both skills, capacity, as well as equipment in our hospitals that are needed for tertiary care. But the decision was taken to expand primary care, which does make sense. So we're sort of following, and government has this, as sort of government officials have discussed this in some briefings on occasion, where they're trying to follow the Cuban model, where there's a huge program in place that provides primary care, which negates the need for lots of tertiary care, for high demand for tertiary care, in theory. All right, so the bulk of expenditure again is on compensation. Of course, in healthcare, lots of high-skilled individuals, doctors, surgeons, specialists, administrators as well, and then of course a large cohort of nurses as well that are relatively well paid as well. And then 30% is spent on goods and services. All right. Now, utilization rates for public healthcare has increased quite significantly. And the increases in expenditure, therefore, do appear to have benefited poorer households the most. And much of these services are free, right? So they're not all free. They're not, and this becomes a problem for provinces who administer the healthcare services. It becomes a problem for their budgets because the no-fee services that are being provided, because it's very costly providing healthcare services. But it does mean that people can access healthcare. People who otherwise cannot afford healthcare do have access as a result of the introduction of free services. All right. Infrastructure expanded significantly over the post-apartheid years. Again, this promoted greater access and reduced travel time to facilities. Of course, getting to a facility is one thing, then one has to consider the wait time there as well, which is significant and is something that gets reported in surveys. For instance, user complaints, using user complaints as a measure, it does appear that the quality is not rated very highly. Surveys find, for instance, that users are dissatisfied with waiting times, that facilities are understaffed, that staff are not well equipped in terms of service provision, not well trained, can be abrupt, etc., and even just incompetent at times. And public facilities have been found to be insufficient or inconsistent in terms of the supply of drugs for chronic ailments. And analyses suggest that public healthcare in South Africa is an inferior good. What this suggests is that, and the reason that we have this result, or that people say this, is because there is a great demand for private healthcare, despite the fact that free healthcare is available to citizens. Often people prefer to go to, they'll pay for private healthcare as opposed to opting for the free services that are available from government. SA compares poorly to our peer countries on aggregate health outcomes, on measures such as child mortality and maternal deaths, which is rather disconcerting. And when compared to private sector facilities, it's found that public sector health services underperform given the available budget, right? So it's not just that private sectors are performing better because they have better budgets. They're also operating a lot more efficiently than public healthcare services, or somewhat more efficiently. Poor performance of public healthcare system can be considered in the context of the heavy disease burden. So that's one issue that we're dealing with. Most of these TB infected patients are seeking healthcare at public institutions, not so much at private institutions. And significant progress has to be made in addressing this challenge. And this challenge is something that is, that's deeply troubling, that a country as well off as ours, in terms of GDP per capita, has these communicable disease burdens. These things can be prevented, and yet we're just not making progress on that. All right. Okay, and that's where I'll leave it. So that was an exceptionally lengthy session. I